When you discover you've lived almost half a century beside a stranger, your entire world collapses. I was 75 years old when I discovered my husband wasn't who I thought he was. Good day, my dears. My name is Irene Foster Thompson. I'm 82 years old and was born in Blue Ridge Springs, a small town in rural Virginia where everyone knew everyone, or at least that's what I thought. Before continuing my story, I'd like to ask you who's watching now to give this video a thumbs up. I also ask that you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, as it helps tremendously. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. It would bring me such joy to know my story is reaching places I've never visited in my 82 years of life. The year was 1958. I was only 15 years old with my whole life ahead of me. In those days, young women like me had a single dream: to find a good husband, start a family, and be happy until the end of our days. That's what my mother, Grace, taught me. It was at the 4th of July picnic that very year when I met Oliver, a handsome 23-year-old who worked at the only bank in our town. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was helping at the bake sale booth, wearing a light blue dress my mother had sewn especially for the celebration. It had ruffles on the skirt and a small bow at the waist. I thought I was the prettiest girl at the picnic, even knowing it wasn't true. My braids were arranged with ribbons matching my dress, and I served the pastries with a shy smile. That's when he appeared. Oliver arrived alone, wearing a crisp white shirt, dark dress pants, and shoes that gleamed even under the dim light of the lanterns illuminating the town square. "How much for the caramel fudge?" he asked, and his voice was different from any I'd ever heard. It wasn't rough like the farmers, nor high-pitched like the schoolboys. It was firm, but gentle, as if each word was considered before being spoken. "2 quarters, I replied, lowering my eyes because I felt my cheeks burning. He bought a piece of fudge and stood there chatting with me while eating it slowly. He told me he'd been working at the bank for 3 years, that he lived alone since his parents had moved to the state capital, and that he enjoyed reading in his spare time. I, who had barely finished elementary school because my father thought too much education spoiled a girl, was impressed by this literate, well-mannered man. That night, he walked me home, always maintaining a respectful distance. My mother watched through the window, as was customary, and when I entered, she smiled in a way she never had before. "That young man has a future, Irene. Don't let him slip away," she said, while braiding my hair for bedtime. The courtship was brief, as was common in those days. 3 months later, Oliver asked for my hand in marriage, and my father didn't think twice before accepting. "A banker in the family," he repeated to anyone who would listen, proud as if he'd won the lottery. And in a way, for a simple family like mine, having a daughter marry a man of position was indeed a kind of lottery. Our wedding took place in January 1961 at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. It was a grand celebration by our small town standards. Oliver insisted on inviting all the important people: Mayor Irving Walters, the sheriff, the most prosperous merchants, and of course, Reverend Timothy, who was a veritable institution in Blue Ridge Springs. I remember my dress was sewn by Mrs. Anderson, the best seamstress in the region, with fabric so fine it had to come from Richmond. After the ceremony, we went to live in a small but comfortable house that Oliver rented near downtown. He promised we would soon have our own home, larger and more beautiful, as soon as he got a promotion at the bank. And how he kept his promises. Less than 2 years after our wedding, we were moving into a corner house with 3 bedrooms, a living room separate from the dining room, and even a yard where I could plant my flowers. I was impressed by how quickly we were able to improve our standard of living. When I asked how he had managed to save money so quickly, Oliver smiled in that mysterious way that only later I would understand, and said, "I have good investments, my flower. A man needs to know how to make his money work for him." The first years of marriage were peaceful. Oliver left early for the bank and always returned at the same time. On Sundays, we attended church together. Afterward, we would have lunch with my parents, or more rarely, he would take me to dine at the only restaurant in town, the Magnolia House. The only cloud in our sky was the delay in having children. After 3 years of trying, we consulted Dr. Jenkins, who after some examinations gave me the devastating news. I could not have children. I cried for weeks on end, feeling less of a woman, less of a wife. Oliver, however, proved understanding. "God knows what he's doing," he would say, while holding my trembling hands. "If we can't have children of our own blood, perhaps we can bless a child who needs parents." It was then that, in 1965, as if by a miracle sent from heaven, Catherine entered our lives. I remember the exact day. It was a rainy Wednesday, and I was preparing dinner when Oliver arrived home, accompanied by Reverend Timothy. Between them was a little girl of approximately 2 years, with large, frightened eyes, clutching a worn cloth doll. "This is Catherine," said the Reverend with his deep voice. "Her parents died in an accident on the highway to Richmond. She has no other relatives, and we've been looking for a family of good character to take her in." My heart filled with love instantly. That child, with her lost look and dark curls, seemed to have been sent especially for us. That very night, Catherine slept in our house, in the room that had waited so long for a child. The adoption was surprisingly quick and uncomplicated. Oliver took care of all the paperwork, and in a few days, Catherine officially became Catherine Foster Thompson. I never questioned the speed of the process. After all, my husband worked at the bank, knew the right people, and Reverend Timothy himself was involved. Who was I to question the ways of Providence? The years passed, and our small family followed a pleasant and stable routine. Catherine grew up strong and intelligent, did well in school, and was admired by everyone for her sweet and polite manner. Oliver was a dedicated father, perhaps even more than I expected. He followed every step the girl took, helped with her lessons, told stories before bedtime. Sometimes I observed them together and noticed a resemblance in the way they tilted their heads when concentrating, or how they furrowed their brows when something bothered them. But I quickly dismissed these thoughts. It was just daily living together, I told myself. Oliver's religious devotion also grew with the years. He never missed Sunday service, actively participated in all church festivities, and in 1975 was invited by the new pastor, Reverend Lawrence, who replaced Timothy when he retired, to be the church treasurer. It was a position of great trust, and Oliver fulfilled it with extreme dedication. He often stayed at church after service, discussing parish matters with the pastor. Meanwhile, Catherine was transforming into a beautiful young woman. At 18 in 1981, she expressed a desire to study law in Richmond. I confess I was apprehensive, a young woman alone, away from home, exposed to all sorts of dangers. But Oliver, surprisingly, enthusiastically supported the idea. "Our daughter deserves the best," he said, with a conviction that admitted no discussion. "I'll work twice as hard if necessary, but she'll have her degree." And so it was. Catherine moved to Richmond, where she stayed in a boarding house for respectable young ladies, recommended by Reverend Lawrence. Oliver made a point of visiting her once a month, always bringing money and supplies. I rarely accompanied him. The long bus journey made me sick, and someone needed to take care of the house. The following years passed peacefully. Catherine graduated with distinction, began working at a law firm in Richmond, and eventually met Robert, a colleague, whom she married in 1990. They settled in Richmond, and although we missed her, Oliver seemed proud of the independent life our daughter was building. Our routine continued unchanged. Oliver at the bank, me taking care of the house, Sunday services, occasional visits to Catherine. The only novelty was that as he aged, my husband became even more devout. He spent hours in private conversations with Reverend Lawrence, and sometimes I caught him kneeling in our bedroom, praying fervently, with an expression of torment that intrigued me. "What troubles you so much, Oliver?" I asked one time, after finding him crying, following one of these prayers. "I'm just thinking about my salvation, Irene," he answered, quickly wiping away his tears. "When you reach my age, you begin to fear divine judgment." I accepted his explanation, although something told me there was more to those tears than the natural fear of life's end. After all, Oliver was only 61 at the time, enjoyed good health, and nothing indicated his end was near. Little did I know that fate had other plans. In 2006, at 68, my husband began showing strange symptoms: tremors in his hands, difficulty speaking clearly, balance problems. After a battery of tests came the devastating diagnosis: a rare degenerative disease with no known cure. The doctors gave us 2, maybe 3 years. Those last years were the most difficult. I watched my husband, once strong and authoritative, waste away day by day. His lucidity, however, remained intact, as if his mind were trapped in a body that refused to obey. During this period, his conversations with Reverend Lawrence became even more frequent and intense. The pastor came to our house almost daily, and they would shut themselves in the bedroom for hours. One afternoon, when I unexpectedly entered with a tea tray, I heard fragments of a conversation that left me intrigued. "She needs to know the truth, Reverend," Oliver was saying, his voice now slurred by the disease. "Are you sure, my son? After so much time?" The pastor responded in a worried tone. When they noticed my presence, both fell silent immediately. I pretended not to have heard anything, served the tea, and left. But those words kept hammering in my head. What truth did I need to know? What had Oliver been hiding from me after so many years of marriage? I never had the courage to ask directly, perhaps out of fear of the answer, perhaps out of respect for my husband's fragile state. I preferred to believe it was just a delusion caused by medication or the proximity of death. In May 2008, Oliver finally found his rest. He passed during sleep, serenely, like someone who simply decides it's time to go. Catherine came with her husband and their 2 children for the funeral, which was celebrated by Reverend Lawrence with a solemn service at the church, the same one where we were married 47 years before. After the ceremony, as the few guests were leaving, the pastor asked me to stay. There, before the altar where I swore eternal love to Oliver, he handed me a yellowed envelope. "Your husband entrusted this to me more than 30 years ago," said Reverend Lawrence, with a grave expression I'll never forget. "He asked that I only give it to you after his death. I prayed a lot before fulfilling this request, and I ask that God give you strength for what is to come." At that moment, with the envelope between my trembling fingers, I had no idea I was about to discover that my entire life beside Oliver had been built upon secrets I never imagined possible. I returned home that afternoon with the yellowed envelope burning between my fingers. The house was silent, empty, without Oliver's presence, even though in recent years that presence had been more like a shadow of the man I knew. Catherine had insisted on staying with me, but I asked her to return to the hotel with her family. Whatever was in that letter, I wanted to face it alone. I sat in the rocking chair on the porch, the same one where Oliver used to read his newspaper on Sunday afternoons. The sun was setting slowly, painting the Blue Ridge spring sky with shades of orange and red. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart that was beating erratically. With trembling hands, not from age, but from fear of the unknown, I opened the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakably Oliver's. Firm, with well-drawn letters, like everything he did. The paper was already yellowed, confirming what Reverend Lawrence had said. This letter had decades of existence. I began to read, and each word was like a stone being added to a wall that slowly separated me from the life I believed I had lived. "My dear Irene," the letter began, "if you are reading these words, it's because I have already departed this world. I have long carried a burden that has not allowed me to live in peace, a secret that has tormented my conscience for decades. I decided to write this confession in 1977, when the weight of guilt became unbearable. I did not, however, have the courage to reveal the truth to you in life, fearing to lose your love and respect. Now that I no longer exist in this earthly plane, I feel I at least deserve to leave you with the truth, however painful it may be." I paused for a moment, feeling my heart tighten. What confession could be so serious that my husband couldn't reveal it in life? An extramarital affair was what I feared. But I would soon discover the reality was much darker. The money that allowed us to buy our house, give Catherine a good education, and live comfortably all these years never came from the bank, as I made you believe. In 1963, 2 years after our wedding, I accidentally discovered a scheme to embezzle funds at the mayor's office. Mayor Irving, along with some council members, was diverting money intended for the construction of the county hospital. I put my hand to my mouth, incredulous. The hospital that never materialized, the one promised for decades that ended up being just a meager clinic. My initial intention was to report the scheme. I even gathered documents and made notes. But one night, after the service, Reverend Timothy called me for a private conversation in the vestry. To my surprise, he knew about my discoveries, but instead of encouraging me to make the report, he offered me an alternative that would change our lives forever. Here, Oliver's handwriting seemed more shaky, as if the hand that wrote it was agitated by the memory. Reverend Timothy explained that the scheme was bigger than I imagined. It involved not only the mayor's office, but also local businessmen and even the diocese, which would receive a substantial donation for the church renovation. He convinced me that a report would serve no purpose. The most that would happen would be me losing my job and us being forced to leave town. Instead, he offered me a place in the scheme. I would use my position at the bank to facilitate transactions, and in return, I would receive a percentage of the diverted funds. I paused again, feeling my stomach turn. It was as if I were reading about a stranger, not the man with whom I shared my bed for almost 5 decades. Oliver, the man of integrity whom everyone admired, participating in a corruption scheme and, more shockingly, encouraged by a pastor. Irene, I have no justifications for what I did. I could say I accepted thinking of giving you a better life, of getting us out of the rented house, of securing our future. But the truth is that I was also seduced by the idea of easy money, of the power it would bring. In the beginning, I told myself it was temporary, that I would gather enough for us to buy our house and then leave the scheme. But as happens with those who take this path, there was never enough. We always needed more: better furniture, a car, savings for the future. Tears streamed down my face as I continued reading. I recalled each expensive gift, each trip, each luxury Oliver provided me over the years, all the fruit of dirty money. All the times I took pride in my hard-working husband, who knew how to make money grow, as he used to say, all lies. But the letter held even more devastating revelations. There is, however, an even greater secret, one that tormented me much more than the embezzlement. It concerns our daughter Catherine. My heart stopped for a moment. Catherine. What could our adopted daughter have to do with all this sordidness? In 1965, a young woman named Emily worked as a secretary at the mayor's office. A humble girl from a simple family, she had gotten the job through Reverend Timothy's recommendation, who knew her difficult situation: sick mother, absent father. Emily was beautiful, intelligent, and to her misfortune soon caught the attention of Mayor Irving, who was married and had a sterling reputation in town. A chill ran down my spine. I vaguely remembered Emily, a dark-haired curly girl I sometimes saw at Sunday service. The mayor began to harass the young woman, using his position of power to pressure her. When she resisted, he threatened to fire her and ensure she would never get another job in the region. In desperation, Emily sought out Reverend Timothy, who, instead of protecting her, convinced her it would be better to cooperate to keep her job. It was during this period that, to my eternal shame, I also became involved with Emily. I read that sentence 3 times, unable to absorb what was written. My husband confessing an infidelity committed more than 40 years ago. But why would this be a greater secret than the corruption? A few months later, Emily discovered she was pregnant. She had no way of knowing who the father was, me or the mayor. Desperate, she threatened to make everything public. The scandal would be devastating, not just for our reputations, but for the entire embezzlement scheme. One stormy night, Emily was found dead on the highway to Richmond. The official report indicated an accident. Her car had supposedly skidded on the wet road and fallen into the river. But the truth, which I only discovered weeks later, was much more sinister. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. Where was that sunny May afternoon? Suddenly, the world seemed cold and dark. Mayor Irving, fearing the exposure of the affair and the scheme, ordered men to scare Emily. He hired 2 men to intercept her on the road and force her to sign a document, giving up her job and promising to leave town. But something went wrong. According to Reverend Timothy, who later told me everything in confession, there was a struggle. Emily resisted and ended up being pushed. She hit her head on a rock and died instantly. The men, panicked, threw her body into the river along with the car to simulate an accident. I sobbed loudly, feeling physically ill, but the letter continued implacably with its revelations. Weeks after the accident, Reverend Timothy called me again to the vestry. He had discovered that before dying, Emily had managed to give birth in secret with the help of a rural midwife. The child, a girl, was being temporarily cared for by this midwife. The pastor then proposed a plan that, in his distorted vision, would solve everything. You and I, who could not have children, would adopt the child. This would avoid investigations into Emily's daughter's whereabouts and give the girl a home. I could no longer read through the tears. I placed the letter on my lap and looked at the sky, now darkened. Stars began to dot the night, impassive to my pain. It was as if the entire universe had conspired to deceive me. With hands trembling even more, I returned to the letter. The girl was Catherine. Our Catherine, whom we always believed to be an orphan of unknown parents, victims of an accident, is actually Emily's biological daughter, and possibly my blood daughter. I never had the courage to take a test to confirm paternity, but I always suspected due to the resemblance, the same face shape, the same way of furrowing her brow when concentrated. I manipulated all the adoption documents using my contacts at the county clerk's office, creating a false story about parents who died in an accident. Everything made sense. Now, the similarities I noticed between Oliver and Catherine over the years, the speed and ease of the adoption, my husband's almost obsessive interest in every aspect of our daughter's life. Irene, I do not expect your forgiveness. I know what I did is unforgivable. I lived all these years carrying this burden, watching Catherine grow up, never knowing her true origin, building our life on lies and blood-stained money. In recent years, I tried to make some reparations. A large part of the diverted money was anonymously donated to community causes, especially to the Fund for Underprivileged Families, which I know has helped many distant relatives of Emily. The letter continued with detailed instructions about a secret compartment in the floor of our basement, where Oliver had stored documents proving the entire story, along with a considerable sum of money. He asked me to use this money to continue the anonymous reparations and, if I deemed appropriate, to tell Catherine the truth. I leave in your hands, my Irene, the burden I carried alone all these years. I pray you find strength to deal with these revelations, and that somehow my late attempts at reparation are enough to guarantee some peace to my tormented soul. I always loved you, even not deserving your love. Oliver. When I finished reading, it was already deep night. I sat there on the porch for hours, staring into the void, trying to reconcile the image of the man I believed I had known with the monster revealed in that letter. That night I did not sleep. How could I? My marriage of almost 5 decades, which I believed to be based on mutual love and respect, was nothing but a lie. My daughter, whom I loved as if she were of my own blood, was the fruit of an infidelity and possibly of a heinous crime. All our comfortable life, our status in the community, everything built upon corruption, lies, and death. With the first light of morning, I made a decision. Even before checking the hiding place mentioned by Oliver, before deciding what to do with the information or whether I would tell Catherine the truth, there was one person I needed to confront: Reverend Lawrence. He knew. All those years, all those private conversations with my husband, he knew everything and never said a word. With the letter in my pocket and my heart hardened by pain and anger, I walked to the church as I did every Sunday for decades. But this time, I wasn't going for spiritual comfort. I was going for answers. And what I would discover in the vestry that morning would forever change my vision, not just of my late husband, but of the entire community where I had lived my whole life. I walked to the church that Sunday morning with heavy steps, so different from my usual brisk walk toward the service. The bell was ringing, calling the faithful, but to me it sounded like a funeral lament, the funeral of everything I believed to be true in my life. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church remained imposing as it had always been since I could remember. Its thick walls, its colored stained glass that filtered the light of the rising sun, the smell of wax and incense that had always brought me comfort, all now seemed like a stage set for a play where I had been, unknowingly, the foolish character. I entered when the church was still almost empty. Only a few elderly ladies like me occupied the front pews, with their heads covered by mantillas and their rosaries between gnarled fingers. I didn't join them. Instead, I walked directly to the side door that led to the vestry. Without knocking, I opened the door and found Reverend Lawrence arranging the vestments for the service. He raised his eyes, surprised by my intrusion, but his gaze soon changed to something more complex, a mixture of pity and apprehension that confirmed it for me. He knew exactly why I was there. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, but I raised my hand, interrupting him. For the first time in my life, I didn't care about the rules of respect I had always followed regarding clergymen. "You knew," I said, my voice low but firm, trembling not from fear, but from a contained anger I had never felt before. "All this time you knew." I took the letter from my pocket and placed it on the table, where the chalices and hosts for the celebration were arranged. That yellowed paper, stained with my tears from the night before, seemed to profane the sacred place. But I didn't care. What was sacred there after all? The church that harbored such sordid secrets for decades? The pastor looked at the letter and then at me, his shoulders falling in defeat. Slowly, he sat on a wooden bench and gestured for me to sit as well. I remained standing. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson, I knew," he finally admitted, his voice tired. "Not from the beginning, but for many years." "How?" I demanded to know, my voice a bit louder than I intended. "How could you keep such a secret? A crime? The death of an innocent young woman? The embezzlement of public funds? A child?" My voice failed when thinking of Catherine, my daughter, who wasn't an orphan as we believed, but the product of an extramarital affair and possibly linked to a murder. Reverend Lawrence took a deep breath before answering. "I learned through confession. Reverend Timothy, on his deathbed in 1976, revealed everything to me. He was tormented, fearing divine judgment. But the seal of confession is sacred, Mrs. Thompson. I couldn't reveal what was entrusted to me in the sacrament." "And Oliver, did he also confess to you?" I asked. "Yes, a few months after I took over the parish. He was devastated by guilt, but also terrified of the consequences. He feared losing everything, his position, his freedom, and mainly you and Catherine." I felt a tear run down my wrinkled face. It was hard to imagine my husband, always so composed and confident, tormented by this terrible secret. "Is that why he became so devout?" I asked, more to myself than to the pastor. "All those services, the donations to the church, the work as treasurer, was it all to appease his guilt?" The pastor nodded slowly. "Part of it, yes, but Oliver truly tried to redeem himself in recent years. He used a large part of the diverted money for noble causes, always anonymously, of course. The retirement home at the edge of town, the renovation of the rural school, the fund for scholarships for underprivileged children, all were financed by him. I felt dizzy with so many revelations. The man with whom I lived for almost 5 decades was a criminal, an adulterer, possibly even an accomplice to a heinous murder, but he was also the anonymous benefactor who transformed the lives of so many needy people in our community. "Catherine?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "Does she know anything about this?" "No," answered the pastor, his tone somber. Oliver was inflexible about that. He wanted to protect her at all costs. I looked through the small window of the vestry, seeing the sun now shining fully, illuminating the side garden of the church. How many times had Catherine played there as a child after Sunday services? How many times had I watched her proudly, never imagining the dark secret behind her origin? I don't know what to do, I confessed, suddenly feeling very old and very tired. How can I look at my daughter knowing she may be the fruit of all this? The pastor rose slowly and for the first time touched my shoulder in a gesture of comfort. Mrs. Thompson, one thing I've learned in all these years hearing confessions is that none of us is just one thing. We are not just our worst mistakes, nor just our best actions. We are all that human complexity that sometimes even we ourselves don't understand. His words, although wise, didn't lessen the pain I felt. I stepped back, moving away from his touch. You should have found a way to warn me, I accused. So many years wasted living a lie. The bell rang again, announcing that the service would soon begin. The pastor looked nervously at the door. We need to continue this conversation later, Mrs. Thompson. The faithful are arriving. There won't be a later, I interrupted, taking back the letter. Not for me. I won't return to this church. And with that, I left through the same side door, avoiding the curious glances of the parishioners who were starting to arrive. I felt an enormous weight in my chest, as if the full magnitude of what I discovered was finally falling on me. It wasn't just my marriage that I discovered to be a farce. It was my faith, my trust in institutions, my very identity as a wife and mother. I returned home staggering, not from age, but from the weight of the revelations. The house that had seemed a welcoming refuge, built with the money from my husband's honest work, now revealed itself to be a monument to corruption and lies. Every piece of furniture, every object, every happy memory lived there seemed contaminated. I went straight to the basement, determined to find the hiding place mentioned by Oliver in his letter. I moved aside some old boxes and, following his precise instructions, located the loose board in the floor. Upon removing it, I found a small safe embedded in the concrete. The combination was our wedding date, 011-51961. A bitter irony. I opened it with trembling fingers and found exactly what the letter mentioned. A folder with old documents, receipts, notes and codes I didn't fully understand, but that clearly recorded the corruption scheme, a notebook with names and values, and several bundles of cash, more than I had ever seen gathered in one place. Among the documents, I found something that wasn't mentioned in the letter. A yellowed photograph of a young woman. I turned it over and read the inscription on the back in feminine handwriting I didn't recognize. To Oliver with affection, Emily, 1964. I looked long at the face in the photograph. She was a pretty girl with dark, curly hair and a shy smile. I searched her features for something of Catherine and found it. The same eye shape, the same delicate chin. How had I never noticed before? I spent the rest of that day and night in a state of numbness, barely able to sleep, tossing in the bed I had shared for so many years with a man I discovered I never truly knew. The next morning brought Catherine, worried because I hadn't answered her calls. "Mom," she called, entering the house with the key she always had. "Is everything all right? I was worried when you didn't show up for the lunch we planned yesterday." I was in the living room, sitting in the same rocking chair, still dressed in the clothes from the day before, my eyes red and swollen from so much crying. Beside her was her husband, Robert, and her 2 teenage children remained in the car, respecting the moment. "Darling," I said, my voice hoarse, "forgive me for not coming. Something happened. Something that changed everything." Catherine approached, kneeling before me as she did when she was a child. Her eyes, so similar to Emily's in the photograph, looked at me with genuine concern. "What is it, Mom? Are you sick? Should we call a doctor?" I looked at this amazing 45-year-old woman whom I raised as my daughter. A successful lawyer, a dedicated wife, a loving mother of 2 wonderful children, raised with love, education, and values, even if the money that provided all this was tainted. What would I tell her? That her biological father could be the man she called father all her life, the fruit of an adulterous relationship, or worse, that she could be the result of an abuse of power by a corrupt politician. That her biological mother was killed under suspicious circumstances? That her entire life was built on lies? "I'm not sick, dear," I finally replied. "Just tired. It's been difficult days since your father's funeral. I couldn't do it." I didn't have the courage to destroy her world as mine had been destroyed, at least not at that moment. "Are you sure that's all it is?" insisted Catherine, always perceptive. "You look like you've been crying for hours." I took a deep breath, seeking strength. "It's the grief, darling, and some discoveries about your father that took me by surprise." Her eyes widened a little. "Discoveries? What kind of discoveries?" At that moment, I made a decision that would change the course of things. I would not tell the whole truth. Not yet, perhaps never. But I would share a version that would allow Catherine to maintain her image of the man who raised her. "I discovered that your father made anonymous donations for years. The retirement home, the rural school, various scholarships, all financed by him without anyone knowing. There was a letter and documents. He never told me. It wasn't a lie, just a merciful omission." "Oh," said Catherine, looking genuinely surprised but also proud. "So Dad had this secret side as a benefactor? I always thought he was generous, but this is extraordinary." "Yes," I agreed, forcing a smile. "Extraordinary." And there, at that moment, I understood that I would have to live with this duality, knowing the complete truth, but choosing which parts to share, not out of cowardice, but out of love. Because sometimes the total truth can be more destructive than healing. That day we had lunch together as a family, Catherine animatedly discussing how we could continue her father's legacy of charity. I agreed with everything, knowing I would use the money from the hiding place for exactly that, transforming something born of corruption into works of good, as Oliver tried to do in his final years. As I observed Catherine with her husband and children, I realized that despite everything I discovered, one thing remained true: the love we felt for her. Oliver, with all his mistakes and crimes, loved Catherine deeply, perhaps even more intensely for knowing the truth about her origin. And I had loved her unconditionally from the first day I saw her, a frightened little girl with a worn cloth doll. That love, at least, was never a lie. The months that followed the discovery of the letter were the most difficult of my entire life. Each morning, I woke with that sense of unreality, as if living a nightmare from which I couldn't awaken. Several times I caught myself calling for Oliver, as I had done for almost 5 decades, only to immediately remember not just his death, but all the revelations that came with it. The house, once so welcoming, became a museum of lies. Each photograph on the walls, each piece of furniture bought with diverted money, each corner where we lived our married life seemed to silently accuse me. At times it was tempting to simply sell everything and move, perhaps to Richmond near Catherine. But something kept me there, anchored to this place that, despite everything, still contained the most precious memories of my life. September 2008 arrived with the first rains after a dry summer. I was alone at home, as usual those days, observing the drops running down the living room window when I heard knocks at the door. It was Martha, my neighbor for more than 30 years, with a still warm cornbread in her hands. "I came to see how you're doing, Irene," she said, her round face marked by sincere concern. "Haven't seen you at church for weeks. Are you sick?" I invited her in, more out of politeness than desire for company. While preparing coffee to accompany the bread, I noticed how Martha discreetly examined the living room, probably checking for signs of neglect or mental imbalance from the recent widow. "I'm fine, just needing time," I vaguely replied, serving the cups. "I understand," she said, though it was clear she didn't completely comprehend. "The loss of a husband like Oliver, we all miss him, especially the church. Reverend Lawrence still hasn't found someone with the same talent for finances. I swallowed the comment, along with a sip of bitter coffee. If Martha knew the origin of my husband's talent for finances. I don't know if I'll return to the parish, I commented, keeping a casual tone. I might need a change. Martha's eyes widened as if I had announced a move to the moon. Leave Blue Ridge Springs? But Irene, you've never lived anywhere else, and your family is here. Your friends, your memories with Oliver. Sometimes memories are exactly the problem, I murmured, more to myself than to her. Before Martha could interrogate me further, we were interrupted by the telephone. It was Catherine calling to let me know she would come on the weekend. I have important news, she said, her voice vibrating with excitement she couldn't contain even over the phone. I promised I would be waiting and hung up. Martha stayed a while longer, sharing the latest town happenings as if I had been absent for years, not just secluded for a few weeks. When she finally left, I felt immense relief, followed almost immediately by a wave of guilt. These people, Martha, the parishioners, the neighbors, knew nothing of the truth. To them, I remained the respectable widow of an honorable man. The weekend arrived, and with it, Catherine. This time she came alone, without her husband or children, which immediately put me on alert. "We need to talk, Mom," she said, after the initial hugs. Her face was serious, but there was no anguish or accusation in her eyes, which reassured me a little. We sat in the kitchen, her favorite place in the house since childhood, where we spent hours making cookies and talking about her day at school. "I've been thinking a lot since you told me about Dad's anonymous donations," she began, holding my hands on the table. "About his legacy, about what we can do to honor his memory." I took a deep breath, fearing the direction of the conversation. I had decided to keep Catherine unaware of the complete truth about Oliver and her origin. But sometimes I feared that she, with her sharp lawyer's mind, would start piecing things together on her own. "I spoke with Robert, and we made a decision," she continued, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We want to create a foundation in Dad's name, the Oliver Foster Thompson Foundation, to continue the work he did anonymously." I felt my heart tighten. A foundation with the name of the man who embezzled public funds, who was involved, even if indirectly, in a young woman's death. "We don't have the resources for that, dear," I tried to argue. "Actually, we do," Catherine replied, surprising me. "I did some research in the county records. Dad had investments he never touched. Stocks, a small property on the outskirts of town, and even a substantial savings account no one knew existed." My blood froze. What else might she have discovered in her research? "How did you find this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm a lawyer, Mom," she smiled proudly. "I know how to track assets and investments. Also, while organizing the probate papers, I found some references in old documents. It was like following a trail of breadcrumbs." I gazed at my daughter, so intelligent, so similar in determination to the man who raised her. Could it be possible she had discovered more than she was revealing? "And there's something else," continued Catherine, her voice suddenly lower, almost hesitant. "I found a box with old photographs at the mayor's office. They were organizing a memorial for former employees." She opened her purse and took out a photograph. My heart almost stopped when I recognized the face. It was Emily, the same one from the photograph I found in Oliver's secret hiding place. "This young woman," said Catherine, looking intently at the image, "worked as a secretary at the mayor's office in the 60s. Emily was her name. When I saw her, it was like looking at a mirror to the past. The resemblance is striking, isn't it?" "Very," I replied, my voice almost a whisper. Catherine raised her eyes to me, a silent question hanging between us. "Did you know her, Mom?" That was the moment of truth, or at least part of it. I could continue sustaining the complete farce or allow a small thread of reality to unravel. "Yes," I admitted after a long silence. "She worked at the mayor's office when your father and I were newlyweds. She was a very nice girl, from the little I knew of her." "What happened to her?" asked Catherine. "No one at the current mayor's office seems to know. The records show she left her job abruptly in 1965, and then nothing." "There was an accident," I replied, carefully choosing my words. On the highway to Richmond. She died very young. Catherine looked again at the photograph, an enigmatic expression on her face. It's strange, isn't it? The resemblance, almost as if we were related. I felt my heart race. Was it now? Was this the moment when the truth would finally come to light? Appearance sometimes plays tricks on us, I said, trying to sound casual. There are people with no kinship who look like sisters, while true siblings can be completely different. Catherine nodded, but there was something in her eyes, a silent certainty that made me fear she already knew more than she was showing. "Mom," she said finally, putting the photograph back in her purse, "I want to use the money Dad left to do something important, something that makes a difference in people's lives in this town," as he tried to do anonymously. Faced with her determined look, so similar to Oliver's when he decided something, I realized I had no choice but to support her decision. Perhaps somehow the tainted money could really be transformed into something good, a redemption, even if late. "I'm with you, daughter," I said, squeezing her hands. "What do you have in mind?" In the months that followed, we worked together creating the foundation. Catherine, with her legal experience, took care of all the bureaucracy, while I contributed knowledge of local needs. We decided to focus on 3 main areas: education for underprivileged children, medical assistance for the elderly, and support for women in vulnerable situations. This last one was my suggestion, thinking of Emily and the circumstances that led to her death. Catherine didn't question my insistence on this point, just agreed it was an important cause. In January 2009, just 8 months after Oliver's death, the foundation was officially inaugurated. The ceremony took place in the parish hall, an irony that didn't escape me considering the church's role in that sordid story. Reverend Lawrence was present, and when our gazes crossed, I saw in him a mixture of approval and relief. Perhaps he too was seeking a form of redemption. "In memory of Oliver Foster Thompson," announced Catherine in the opening speech, "a man who believed each of us has the responsibility to improve the lives of the less fortunate." As she spoke, looking at the audience with eyes bright with emotion, I noticed how everyone observed her with admiration. Among those present were local authorities, including the current mayor, political descendants of that same Irving Walters who had been Oliver's accomplice in the past. I wondered if any of them suspected the origin of the resources that would now be used for the community's good. "This is just the beginning," continued Catherine. "The foundation intends to expand its activities in the coming years, reaching not just our town, but the entire region." After the event, when we were alone again at home, Catherine hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Mom," she said, emotional, "for supporting this, for standing by me. I know it hasn't been easy since Dad passed. If only she knew how true her words were." "It's the right thing to do," I replied simply. That night, after Catherine left for Richmond, I sat again in the rocking chair on the porch. The sky was clear, sprinkled with stars, and the warm January breeze brought the scent of jasmine that Oliver had planted years ago. I thought about how life takes unexpected turns. The money that had been diverted from building a hospital was now financing medical assistance for the elderly. Resources obtained through corruption were creating educational opportunities. And most impressively, the daughter born of such tragic circumstances was now, unknowingly, indirectly honoring the memory of her biological mother by helping women in situations similar to Emily's. Was it a form of poetic justice? Or just the universe finding ways to balance things, even when the paths are twisted? I had no definitive answers, just the certainty that despite all the lies and pain, something good was being born from the ashes of the past. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to find some peace. The foundation grew rapidly in the years that followed. With each successful new initiative, each life transformed, I felt a mixture of pride and melancholy. Catherine was building something genuinely good, but on foundations she didn't know were so problematic. Until one day, in March 2012, almost 4 years after Oliver's death, I received an unexpected call from my daughter. "Mom," she said, her voice strangely contained. "I need to talk to you in person. It's important. I'll be there tomorrow." And it was during that visit that I discovered some secrets, no matter how well kept, have mysterious ways of coming to light. What I didn't imagine was how this final revelation would transform not just my relationship with Catherine, but also the way I saw the entire past. I'll never forget Catherine's face when she arrived that March afternoon. Normally expansive and smiling, she was serious and contained, as if carrying an immense weight. She hugged me longer than usual, and I noticed her hands trembling slightly. "Let's sit down, Mom," she said, guiding me to the living room. "I have something important to show you." We settled on the sofa, the same sofa where Oliver used to nap on Sunday afternoons after lunch. Catherine opened her leather briefcase, a gift from him on her 30th birthday, and took out a brown envelope. "Last week, we found an old archive during the renovation of the mayor's office annex," she began, her voice controlled but with an underlying tension. "Documents that had been sealed for decades. Among them was this." She opened the envelope and took out some yellowed sheets. I immediately recognized the official letterhead of Blue Ridge Springs from the 60s, the old coat of arms that was replaced in the 80s. "It's an internal investigation into financial irregularities from 1963 to 1965, explained Catherine, signed by the then Vice Mayor, Gerald Matthews. Apparently, he suspected embezzlement in the hospital funds and initiated a secret inquiry. My heart raced. Vice Mayor Gerald. I vaguely remembered him, a thin, quiet man who rarely appeared at town social events. "Here," continued Catherine, pointing to a specific paragraph, "he mentions that he suspected the bank's involvement, specifically an employee named Oliver Foster Thompson." I looked at the paper as if it were a snake ready to strike. There they were, in black and white, the first official evidence of my husband's activities. "But the most interesting part comes now," said Catherine, turning the page. "Gerald mentions a young female employee of the mayor's office named Emily Morgan, who apparently had concrete proof of the corruption scheme and was willing to testify." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling a sudden vertigo. So she wasn't just romantically involved with Oliver and the mayor. She knew about the corruption scheme and was planning to denounce them. "The investigation stopped abruptly in May 1965, continued Catherine. "The last note from Gerald says Emily had disappeared and that he feared for his own safety. 2 weeks later, he resigned and moved to another state." Catherine put the documents aside and took something else from the envelope. The photograph of Emily she had already shown me before, but now accompanied by a death certificate. "I found this in the county clerk's archives. Emily Morgan, 23 years old, died on May 18, 1965. Victim of an automobile accident on the highway to Richmond." But the strange thing, Mom, is that there's no police record of this accident. I consulted the archives of the sheriff's office from that time. Nothing. I felt my mouth go dry. Catherine wasn't just discovering fragments of the truth. She was actively investigating, putting together the pieces of the puzzle I had tried to keep hidden. "And there's more," she continued, relentless in her search for the truth. "In the county records, I found something truly surprising." My heart almost stopped when she took a third document from the envelope, a birth certificate. The baby's name, Catherine Morgan, born on March 14, 1965, 2 months before Emily's death. Mother, Emily Morgan. Father, not declared. "This is me, isn't it, Mom?" Catherine asked softly, her eyes fixed on mine. There was no accusation in her voice, just a search for confirmation of something she already knew. I felt tears streaming down my face. After so many years hiding the truth, lying by omission, deceiving the person I loved most in the world, I had no more strength to continue. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's you." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Catherine showed no anger or despair, just observed me with eyes that I now clearly recognized as identical to Emily's. "Why did you never tell me?" she finally asked. "About my real mother, about how I came to you." I took a deep breath, knowing the time for complete truth had come. I could no longer protect her with well-intentioned half-truths and omissions. "Because the story is much more complicated and painful than you can imagine, dear," I replied. "And because your father, Oliver, made me swear I would never reveal it. He's my biological father, isn't he? That's why he was always so protective, so obsessed with my well-being?" "Possibly," I admitted. "He believed so, though he was never absolutely certain." And then, there in the living room where we lived so many moments as a family, I told Catherine the whole truth about the corruption scheme, about Oliver's involvement with Emily, about the suspicious circumstances of her death. I told her about the letter Oliver left me, about the secret compartment in the basement, about the diverted money now feeding the foundation. Catherine listened to everything in silence, occasionally wiping a discreet tear. When I finished, it was already night, and we were exhausted. Me, for finally exposing the truth kept for so many years. Her, for absorbing a story that completely turned her origins upside down. "I understand why you hid this from me," she said finally. "You were protecting me, as you always have." "I feared the truth might destroy you," I confessed. "That you would reject everything, us, your past, even yourself." "Part of me wants to be furious," admitted Catherine, "for having been deceived my whole life, for not having known my biological mother, for having called father a man who may have been involved in her death." "I would understand if you hated me now," I murmured, feeling a void in my chest. "But I don't," she replied, taking my hands in hers. "Because I understand that, despite everything, you and Oliver genuinely loved me. You gave me a home, education, values, and in the end, he tried to repair his mistakes, even if belatedly." "You are a much wiser woman than I ever was," I said, emotional. "I have just one question, Mom," continued Catherine. "Did you know about all this while it was happening? About the corruption scheme? About Emily?" "No," I responded with sincerity. "I only discovered after your father's death, with the letter he left. I lived almost 5 decades beside a man whose most important actions I completely ignored." Catherine nodded, looking a little relieved. "And what do we do now?" she asked. "With all these documents, with this truth," it was a question I had been asking myself since I received Oliver's letter. What to do when we discover our life was built on lies? How to transform this knowledge into something constructive? "I think you've already started doing it," I replied. "The foundation isn't just a way to honor Oliver's memory. It's also a way to repair the harm that was done, to transform the diverted money into something that really benefits the people who should have been benefited originally. As for Emily, my biological mother," she said, "she deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, but as the brave woman who was willing to denounce a corruption scheme, even facing powerful men." That night, Catherine stayed with me. We slept in the same bed, as we did when she was small and had nightmares. By morning, we went down to the basement together, and I opened the secret compartment again, showing her everything Oliver had kept: the incriminating documents, the money, Emily's photograph. In the days that followed, we made important decisions. The foundation would not only continue, but would be expanded. Catherine suggested renaming it the Emily Morgan Foundation, a way to honor her biological mother and publicly recognize her existence. "But that will raise questions," I argued. "People will want to know who Emily was, why we're honoring her." "Then we'll tell the truth," Catherine replied, with determination. "Not all the sordid details, but the essential. That she was a brave young woman who lost her life fighting against corruption, and that I am her biological daughter, adopted by you and Oliver after her death." I admired my daughter's courage. Where I saw only potential for scandal and shame, she saw an opportunity for justice and honesty. In June 2012, the foundation was officially renamed. At the ceremony, Catherine made a moving speech about her recent discovery, about how she found her biological mother decades after her death, and how she intended to honor her legacy. Surprisingly, the community responded with support and admiration. Some older people in town vaguely remembered Emily and commented on her beauty and gentleness. Others, younger, were inspired by the story of a woman who faced the established power in a time when few dared to do so. Reverend Lawrence, now elderly and frail, attended the ceremony. When our gazes crossed, I saw in his eyes a mixture of remorse and relief. Later, he approached us. "You did the right thing," he said simply. "Emily will finally have the justice she deserved." A month later, he announced his retirement, ending decades of service to the parish. Before departing for a religious retreat in another town, he confessed to me that he had always felt partially responsible for Emily's death, for not acting when Reverend Timothy told him the truth on his deathbed. The investigation into Emily's death was officially reopened in 2013, after Catherine, using her influence as a respected lawyer, presented all the documents we found to the district attorney. The case, however, had already expired, and almost all those involved were dead. Mayor Irving had died in 1987. The men who would have been hired to scare Emily were never identified, and concrete evidence was scarce after so many decades. Still, the truth came to light, an incomplete truth, imperfect, without the punishment that might have been deserved, but a truth that allowed Emily to be finally recognized and remembered. For Catherine, the discovery of her origins was transformative. At 48, she finally knew part of her story that had always been absent. She visited the simple grave where Emily was buried, an unmarked grave in the town cemetery that now received a proper headstone with her name and dates of birth and death. "I feel as if I found a part of myself that was lost," she told me, as we placed flowers on that grave for the first time. "I still love Oliver as my father. I'm still grateful for everything you both did for me. But now, I also have Emily, and that completes my story." For me, the revelation of the truth brought a peace I didn't expect to find. The crushing weight of the secret was finally lifted, allowing me to breathe deeply for the first time in years. There was still pain. There were still moments when I wondered how I could live decades beside a man without really knowing him. But there was also a kind of freedom, the freedom that comes from having nothing more to hide. Now, in 2025, I look back and see how that letter changed everything. I am 82 years old and have spent the last 17 years living with a completely different understanding of my own story. The Emily Morgan Foundation has become one of the most respected charitable institutions in the region, helping hundreds of women in vulnerable situations find education, employment, and support. Catherine, now 60, left corporate law to dedicate herself fully to the foundation. Her children, my dear grandchildren, grew up knowing the complete story of their family, both the beautiful parts and the ugly parts. The eldest, Michael, became an investigative journalist, inspired by the story of the biological grandmother he never knew. As for me, I continue to live in the same house, surrounded by memories of a life I now understand very differently. I don't go to church as frequently as before, but I've found a more personal spirituality, less dependent on institutions and more connected with my own experiences. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the silence of the empty house seems deeper, I imagine Oliver and Emily, two lovers whose lives intertwined with tragic consequences, but who, through Catherine, left a legacy that transcended their mistakes and weaknesses. And as for that letter, the aged paper that contained Oliver's confessions, Catherine and I decided to keep it stored in a bank-safe deposit box. Perhaps someday, when I am no longer here, she will decide to share it with her children, or perhaps she will choose to let some truths remain just between us. What I know for certain is that that letter, delivered by a reluctant pastor after my husband's death, not only revealed secrets buried for decades, it offered us the chance to rewrite the ending of our story, not to erase the mistakes of the past, but to transform them into something that finally did justice to all involved. As the saying my mother used to repeat goes, "The truth may hurt, but it also sets you free." And that's exactly what happened to us. We were wounded by the truth, but we were also freed by it. And in that freedom, we found a redemption that none of us imagined possible. Today, when I look at Emily's portrait, which we affectionately keep in the main hall of the Foundation's headquarters, I no longer see a stranger, a rival, or a distant victim. I see the brave woman who gave birth to my daughter, the woman whose spirit lives through Catherine and the countless others who have been benefited by the work we do in her name. And that, more than anything else, is the true miracle born from that unexpected letter. The transformation of a story of corruption, betrayal, and death into a narrative of redemption, truth, and justice. Late, but justice nonetheless. My dears, if this story touched your heart in any way, please leave a like on this video. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, press the subscribe button right now so you don't miss any of our real-life stories that can bring important reflections to your own path. I would also love to know in the comments where you're watching from. I read each message with great affection, and it moves me to know that my words, at 82 years old, can reach people in places I've never visited. Thank you for dedicating this time to listen to the account of an elderly lady who learned, even if belatedly, that truth, however painful it may be, is always the path to liberation. Until next time, God willing.